I am so excited for all of us because this morning we get to learn from Marsha Liss. I'm going to give a little introduction and then you could be ready. Actually, sitting up there is part of how I was going to start, which is that there is no one more passionate than Marsha. She is always has a new idea, always has a project, always has something she's working on. From the very first time I walked into this building, Marsha has had ideas, and her latest, by the way, is a new Shabbat morning service. So wanted to say that more informally about Marsha, her passion. And now I want to give you a little bit of her bio, because these are great bios that have been going around about all of our summer Divrei Torah teachers. Marsha has been a member for over 20 years. She was a professor of psychology and human development at California State University and retired as an attorney with the U.S. Department of Justice, and now is enjoying full-time focus on her volunteer work at Bethel and in the community at large. Marsha's favorite holiday is Passover, and her discussion today will be based on the Passover theme that her family used this year. Her proudest accomplishments are her sons, who grew up at Bethel starting in the preschool and through B'nai Mitzvah and confirmation. And I'm sure that Joel and Sam are listening in spirit or have been involved in hearing about your teaching this morning. So we're gonna hear from Marsha now, and then everyone's invited after lunch at around 12:30. We'll be back here in the chapel for a follow-up discussion. So, Marsha.
It was quite amazing. Oh, I'm wondering who that woman was. She sounds very good. Deborah said that we do pick a different theme for our Passover Seder every year, and usually I had done them for many years. They cover a broad range of topics. It's a little mishuggy, but it works, and we do a new Haggadah outline. This year, one of my sons said to me, he was very troubled, and he wanted to talk about the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade. I said, okay, good. We'll talk a lot about Shifra and Puah. There's a whole lot about the importance of the midwives, the starting and the saving of the babies. Moshe, an example of saving of the babies. How did they do that? How did they, as they were going through the desert, have all these babies born, presumably, starting for the next generation? So it sounded like a good thing to do. We were going to do that. Around the same time, same son, my son Sam, and I had seen a movie in which there was a religious sect living in a very isolated area. And there were some problems the women were coming up with about how they were treated, how their daughters were treated. And there got to be a little bit of a rebellion. And they were, not outwardly, but they were on the sly talking. And some of them were discussing, should they leave? And that is the question that we then came up with is, choices. What are the difficult choices that the Passover story presents us? I know some of you have been waiting since the tikkun that we had to cancel my talk with bated breath, waiting to hear the answer of, did all the Israelites leave Mitzrayim? And that's our story. When I began to think about this as our Passover theme, one of the first things I did is I asked Rabbi Megdal, did all the Israelites leave Egypt? She looked at me and she says, maybe there's a midrash. Perfectly clergy answer, because it says, congregant, go study. Through my studying, which is what we're going to do, I eventually did ask Rabbi Harris, who shrugged and said, I don't know. But what is the story? How many of us have believed, through all of our education and all of our learning and all of our time in the synagogue, that the Israelites left Egypt? They all left Egypt, right? Oh, some people are saying, well, maybe not all. But we have this story that leads us to think the Israelites came. We read it in abbreviated form. So let's go back to the beginning of these Israelites in Egypt. Who were these Israelites? What did they do with their lives? What was it like being an Israelite in Mitzrayim? In fact, this morning, one of the things we read in one of the first few aliyot was that the Egyptians treated them harshly, and made them do hard labor. Okay, this is not a lecture. This is going to be some discussion, so please answer questions as I come up with. What kind of jobs did the Israelites have? What was that? Building the pyramids or the great cities of Ramses, yes. Building the pyramids. So there were a lot of Israelites probably involved in the construction business. Difficult business to begin with. And how do we know how difficult it was? What do we know that tells us how difficult it was to be a construction worker? You want me to talk? Okay. We know that at some point, Moshe observes a slave master, the supervisor, whipping an Israelite, we presume an Israelite or an Egyptian, a construction worker. And then he runs away. He runs away because not only did he turn on the slave master, he killed him. All right. So at that point, what are you as a construction worker thinking about this guy Moshe? What is your impression of him? He's a hero, right? He's a future union leader, right? He's going to lead a rebellion. Well, look at this guy. He's standing up for us. We can look at it also. What else? What does this say about him in terms of his views, his outlook of the world? A little bit of a moral compass, perhaps, that maybe you watch out for what isn't right and how to treat people. What else might Israelites have been doing other than working in construction?
Well, they may have actually been working in the fields to some extent, partly because every time the Nile would overflow, pretty much everybody would go to work in that kind of.
So they could have been involved in agriculture. And I think it's not a stretch of the imagination to think the conditions of agriculture may have been similar to construction work, and you got what you could take. Anything else that may have been a little bit easier work? Shepherding, if you don't mind the smell of a whole bunch of sheep. Yes, Abe.
Domestic workers?
Domestic workers for whom? For the ruling class. Maybe you even worked in the palace. Maybe you swept the floors, worked in the kitchen, took care of children, sewed or whatever, worked on clothing. What was that life probably like? Maybe it was a little bit easier. One of the things that we read a little bit, different part of the story is, from Numbers, the riffraff in their midst felt a gluttonous craving, and the Israelites wept and said, "If only we had meat to eat. We remembered the fish that we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic." Were the construction workers and the agricultural workers eating that? But those of them who worked perhaps in the ruling class in the palace may have gotten scraps at the end of the day. They may have gotten clothing as part of their extra perks. So a lot of things may have been very different for some Israelites. So Moses comes back from his flight to the desert. And he turns to these different types of Israelites, especially the construction workers, and he says, "I just had a talk with this talking burning bush who said he was God, who says it was God. And the bush told me that we should all get ready and leave Mitzrayim." A little strange story, isn't it? What do you think about that? What were the Israelites going to think about that? He's kind of crazy. He's talking to crazy. What was he eating or something? He's a little bit crazy. What?
Too much sun.
Too much sun. Yes, absolutely. But so those are some, thoughts about. And besides, remember, he was a crazy, pampered guy to begin with. So what does he know about what they're doing? Would you follow Moshe? Why would you follow Moshe and start getting ready and leaving for the desert and the walk to the promised land?
You talked about it before.
What?
You talked about it before. You took it up with the slaves.
What? Mitchell, finish your sentence.
He stood up for the slaves.
He stood up for them. So, hey, this guy's a leader. Good answer.
I said you would not, they would not have, not right away, they would not have.
No, I'm asking, why would you follow? I'm looking for the answers as to why would some people say, sure, I'll go. If you have faith, you were a believer, and God doesn't present itself in human form, so God had to take the shape of perhaps a burning bush and talk. So you had the faith, okay? Any alternative may be better. It can't get worse. This has been really bad for us here.
Depends how bad your life was. Like you were saying before, if you were being abused and not treated well and not being fed, maybe if you were living in the palace and getting the fish and the fruit and your life was okay, then you might say, oh, I don't know about this.
Now, first I want to know about the why would you follow. We're looking at if you were miserable, maybe you also want to stay with your community. Your neighbor's going. The other workers you worked with were going. Your family is going. And you want to stay with your community. And this guy Moshe, maybe he's got some power. Maybe you think about, well, I really want to stay. But tomorrow, my supervisor's going to say, did you know about this? If you knew about this, why didn't you tell us? Failure to report, probably even then, was not a good thing. So the question is now, why would you stay? Rebecca, you started to talk about why might you stay.
I mean, if your life isn't terrible and you're, yes, you're working for somebody else, but you have a place to sleep, you have food,
It's not,
you're not being beaten, then why would I go wander in the desert?
why should I follow this crazy guy, go out into the desert, into the sun, where I don't know what we're going to have? Maybe we're not going to have the fish and the meat and the cucumbers. Might fear going out into the sun in the desert. What is going to be there? You've heard about the snakes. You've heard about other stories of things that happen in the desert. Why would I go there? My family's staying. I'm staying with my family. I'm not going. Maybe it's better to serve than to die in the desert. And there's that phrase, the devil you know versus the devil you don't know. One other reason. Maybe you were assimilated. Maybe this power of saying faith, community, says, I kind of like it here. My kids play with the little Egyptian kids down the block. My kids are learning. They had good child care provided because I worked in the palace. I had good child care. Why would I bother? Things are pretty good. And then the plagues come. Does your opinion, if you're an Israelite and you're thinking of staying, change as the plagues come? Even if the plagues seem to have affected only the Egyptians, maybe they also affect you. And that's a question. And Moshe, the plagues come every time Moshe goes in to see the Pharaoh. He says there's going to be another plague. This guy's got power. Maybe we ought to follow him. This is pretty incredible. So over time, things change. The momentum's building. They're seeing more and more plagues visited by this God on the Egyptians. So let me turn to another reading. When we get to the 9th plague, the plague of darkness. Wait a second. Rashi on Exodus. There was the darkness of gloom when no man saw another for those 3 days. And there was moreover another period of 3 days' darkness, twice as thick as this, when no man rose from his place, who happened to be sitting when this second period of darkness began was unable to rise. And one who was then standing was unable to sit. And why did he bring darkness upon them? Because there were wicked people among the Israelites of that generation who had no desire to leave Egypt. And these died during the 3 days of darkness, so that the Egyptians might not see their destruction and say, these Israelites too have been stricken. So not everybody, when the 10th plague comes, is ready to leave, either because they have succumbed during the days of darkness, or they were those who said, yeah, not me, I'm not going. Interesting question. What were they doing during these days of darkness and during these plagues when the Egyptians are distracted by frogs and blood and locusts and all these other things in the darkness? Some also suggest that maybe that was when some of the Israelites also performed some criminal acts, such as robbery, gold, and gems from the Egyptians. The very ones that, of course, we later see used in the golden calf and in the creation of the Mishkan, because there were not really mines that they're digging up in the middle of the desert to find all of the gems. I'm going to just keep going, okay? All right. So Moshe wants to take them all. I mean, it's his thought is he's going to take them all. Seems that there's some intervention by the darkness, by other reasons, so some of them are no longer alive. And then there are those who say, not me, I'm not going. So there was being chosen to leave, and then whether you chose to leave. So it's a very important theme that I think is also a very Jewish theme. How many Israelites, how many male Israelites were there at Sinai? We read this not too long ago. About 603,000. That's a lot of people. That's about telling the population of D.C., get up and leave at once. Right. So that's how many wound up at Sinai. We don't know whether they dropped off proportionally, disproportionately. Okay. But it still leads us to wonder, did they all go? Another piece of Rashi. The word chamushim means provided with weapons. A similar sense it says in Joshua, and ye shall pass over chamushim, armed. Onkelos too translated this as armed in Aramaic, just as he translated the word vayerek in Genesis, which means, and he armed his trained servants. However, Rashi continues, another explanation of chamushim is only 1 out of 5, chamasha, went forth from Egypt, and 4 parts of the people died during the 3 days of darkness because they were unworthy of being delivered, either because they did evil or they didn't believe, they were too assimilated. Rabbeinu Bachya quotes the same source and adds, there are those who say only 1 in 50 left Egypt, or 1 in 500 left Egypt. Rabbi Lunchitz builds on the original 4 out of 5 message and adds, even those who wanted to leave Egypt, God had to take them out with a strong hand and against their will, against what was better for them. And now you must watch over them and will not say that they went for the worst. So if we think about 4 out of 5, that means 603,000 were at Sinai of the men. That means there were like 3 million, the size of the population of Chicago. Maybe this was a way of whittling down what was doable, or maybe there were a lot of Israelites who were really not clinging to what being an Israelite should be. Now, how do we think then about this story? How do we think and question what many of us were taught is that the Israelites left Egypt? According to what sources I've just given you, and I do have some handouts, I just didn't want anyone reading them before it was time, is maybe they didn't all leave. The question I want to ask at this point is, why do most people believe that the Israelites en masse, and we teach it this way, left Mitzrayim? What do we gain as Israelites, as a modern culture, for saying we all left Mitzrayim? Any thoughts? Or are you too surprised I'm asking the question?
Power? They feel
that we feel good about our people having all left and followed God and listened and were part of our belief system. Adam?
I think it's the retelling of the story that we were all slaves in Egypt, and that we all had to learn how to no longer be slaves. That a lot of what we translate from then to now is the learning how to be free and the habits of being slaves. So it helps the narrative if we all, as if we were there and we left. We don't want to tell a story whereas, well, I was a cook, so I kind of stayed because I had, a good time. It helps the narrative if we all as if we were in Egypt, it's as if we left.
It's a consistent, streamlined story. Yeah, Alan?
The people who stayed behind, they were lost. We never heard their stories. So, we don't know that people were left behind. We don't know that people stayed behind. So therefore, everybody left.
The history of those people who stayed in Mitzrayim ends when those who left followed Moshe into the desert. We don't know much more about them. Did they go south and become the Jews of Ethiopia? Were they a tribe of people who then migrated to another area? Or did they just totally assimilate, never to be heard from again? Elliot.
With respect to the rabbis, the numbers don't make sense. Okay, because Moses is supposed to be 3 generations from Levi. And as a result, maybe 4, I'm pretty sure it's 3 generations from Levi, but even if it's 4 or 5, you're talking 5, maybe 7 generations from 12 people getting to 600,000. That alone is an impossible set of numbers, especially oppressed in slavery. Now you're talking 3 million in 5, 7 generations, and yet, throughout the rest of history, we barely got over that number. The numbers, it can't be, if there were 600,000 men, which means you probably had 1.2 million people, just that number. And that probably means that they took the other slaves with them, not just the Israelites.
Quite likely.
So the leaving behind benefits, it doesn't make any sense.
It's a very good... Elliot's raising the question, repeating it because each of your comments so that people who are listening at home can hear. Elliot raises the question, does those numbers really make sense? Even at the 1 out of 5, let alone the 1 out of 50 or the 1 out of 500, do those numbers really make sense in the numbers of generations? One of the other writers would say, the children of Israel were fruitful and swarmed and multiplied and became huge. A woman would give birth to 6 at one time. See, in those days, sextuplets were okay. And you say that 1 in 500 went out. I swear by the Torah temple service, it was not 1 in 500 that went out, but fewer. Rather, many Jews died in Egypt. And when did they die? During the days of darkness. Okay. So we've said that maybe it streamlines it, maybe it's simpler, maybe it's a continuity, it shows us our issues of power. Let's flip that for a second. What would we have as our story? And what would be the point of the story if we did say only 1 in 5 of the Israelites left? What would that mean for us in our education, in our observance, in our thoughts?
To me, it means God was not as all-powerful as we wanted to understand at that time, that God saved all of us, and yet if most stayed, I'm like, well, boy, there really weren't that many strong adherents there.
All right, so what you're saying, Rob, is that, Richard, that there is, God may not have been perceived or be perceived now as powerful, or everyone would have followed, right? There was something there. Yeah.
I'd say the role of human agency would become much more central.
Yes. And that's a very interesting point, because that says we, in those Israelites who chose, human agency and human will, which is what God has given us. God may be powerful, But God doesn't determine everything we do. God may foresee what we are going to do, that there are choices. And I started this with talking about choices. There's a lot of interest about choices. I thought there was another question back there. Was there another one? No. Let's skip forward a couple of millennia to the 20th and 21st century, Common Era. What does these change? What is the second perspective? What is our original training of what we think happened and these other issues that the rabbis and I have brought up? How does this relate to issues of the 20th and 21st century? Adam, go ahead.
Well, there are times in history when people have had to choose between leaving a place and staying in a place.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how it relates to that, I haven't formulated, but that's what your question
Mm-hmm.
brings up in my mind in terms of, who left Europe to escape, who stayed because they thought it was, improbable that would happen. Are we at another juncture
Mm-hmm.
where that question needs to be asked again?
Are we asking, Adam's saying, are we asking the question, or maybe we're considering the question of what has happened? Ben, you'll be next. In modern times of leaving issues during the Holocaust about who has left, staying with our faith, and what does that mean for the numbers? But you're also bringing up that issue of where did we choose? Ben?
We heard about before the Holocaust about the rabbis who told the Jewish congregations in Europe, this is better than me. Don't go to Israel. You'll die in the desert. Stay with us. You'll be safe.
Very interesting point. There were some rabbis who said, no, don't leave it. Where are you going to go to Israel? Israel is a desert. You won't be safe there. It's not good for you. You're better off staying here within our community. Toby?
So the other part of the problem is we get a lot of mileage out of the Exodus story, right? It's not just the leaving, it's what people do during the journey. It's how no one is entirely bad or entirely good. People can repent, people can learn from mistakes, et cetera, and so and we know nothing about the people who stayed, right? So their lives could have been worse or could have been better, but we don't know. We have no idea. And so if we don't focus on the journey, we lose a lot more than simply leaving Mitzrayim and getting to the promised land. We lose all the stuff in between.
We lose all the lessons that we learned during the desert, all the things that make us an Israelite people that has succeeded all the way down to today, all of the traditions, some of the holidays, all of those things. We lose that because there would have been no time to get those. I want to leave with two other thoughts. Mishnah Halachot says, why do they establish 4 cups for Seder and not 5? The Zohar explains that the Kohen may not enter the holy place inebriated with wine, even though wine gladdens the heart of humanity. With wine, the beginning is joy, and the end is sadness. Give wine to the bitter at heart, that when we left Egypt, 1 in 5 left, and 4 of 5 died in Egypt. And even so, we left Egypt on account of their merit. We established for them 4 cups to symbolize mourning and comfort on the 4 parts of the seeds of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who died in Egypt. I want to leave you on one last thought. When I was in Ukraine 26 years ago, my driver and guides were students from University of Kiev, Hillel. And it was a couple. He was a graduate student. She was an undergraduate. And no matter where we went over that 3-day period, each day, the following conversation would happen. And he would say, but if we were in Israel, leading a full Jewish life, we would have a wonderful life. We would be fulfilled. We would also be able to prosper and not be fearful. And she would say, but my family, my parents, my grandparents are here. We need to stay to rebuild Jewish Kiev. I guess at that point they called it Kiev. And that has struck me over time of these decisions are still being made, even in the 21st century, about should we go, should we stay. And the last item is when we all leave, if all these Jewish Ukrainians had left, where is the voice for anti-Semitism? Where is the voice for Israel? Thank you. Shabbat Shalom. And there are some handouts if you would like.